Welcome to our Texas Real Estate Contract Series. In this course, we'll break down the critical components of the contracts you'll encounter in your real estate transactions. Whether you're a seasoned agent looking for a refresher or a newer agent ready to build confidence, this series will equip you with the knowledge and tools you need to navigate your contracts with clarity and precision. Mastering these details will not only protect your clients, but also elevate your professionalism. Let's dive in and simplify the complexities together. Hi, I'm Laura Motelet, a productivity coach and realtor with Keller Williams. If you'd like to know more about Keller Williams and what they have to offer, please message me or use one of the links in my description below. Let's get started. Hey there, here we go. We are going to continue the contract series, and today we're going to be talking about addendum for properties subject to mandatory membership in a property owners association. This form is not to be used with condominiums. So let's get started. The first thing I want to say about this form is when you are filling out the 1 through 4 contract for an offer, it does ask you on the form, is this property in an HOA or is it not in an HOA? Or specifically it says, are you in a mandatory membership or property owners association, which is a homeowners association basically. So if you are, you're going to click yes or no. If you say yes, then this form is absolutely required. So let's get started. We're going to start by putting in the full address of the property. It asks for street address and city, and that's what we have here. Now, the Property Owners Association name and the phone number is required for this document to be complete. You can get that information directly from the MLS. Most of the time the seller is going to have information on it, so it should be pretty easy to find. Go to the MLS of the listing and look for the HOA information. So first, subdivision information. This is a two-part document. One, subdivision information. Subdivision information means two things. One, a current copy of the restrictions applying to the subdivision and bylaws and rules of the association. And two is a resale certification, all of which are described by section 207.003 of the Texas Property Code. So let's take a look at our options here. Option number 1. Let's say we're going to give 14 days because it does take time to obtain the information. So within 14 days after the effective date of the contract, the seller shall. Right here we have shall. What does shall mean? Shall means must. Must obtain, pay for, and deliver the subdivision information to the buyer. If seller delivers the subdivision information, on time that is, buyer may terminate the contract within 3 days after the buyer receives the subdivision information or prior to closing, whichever one comes first, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. If the buyer does not receive the subdivision information, buyer, as buyer's sole remedy, may terminate the contract at any time prior to closing, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So if you're putting your seller on the hook for this, to obtain this information, make sure the information is obtained and provided to them in a timely manner on time. So let's say we're going to go ahead and select option number 2 right here. Again, we're going to give 14 days. So within 14 days after the effective date of this contract, the buyer shall means required, obtain, pay for, and deliver a copy of the subdivision information to the seller. If the buyer obtains the subdivision information within the time required, the buyer may terminate the contract within 3 days after buyer receives the subdivision information or prior to closing, whichever comes first, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So it's the same as you see on option 1. Now, if buyer, due to factors beyond the buyer's control, is not able to sustain the subdivision information within the time required, buyer may, as buyer's sole remedy, terminate the contract within 3 days after the time required or prior to closing, whichever comes first, and the earnest money will be refunded. Now notice here it says only if it's not out of the buyer's control. So if the buyer checks this one, or you check this for your buyer, and they do absolutely nothing to obtain the information, then they're not going to get their earnest money back. So make sure they do their due diligence and they go and obtain the information. Now, most of the time, the bylaws information, which is what we're talking about here, you can just go to the internet and obtain that from the HOA website itself. Most of the time, the seller is going to have that information or can obtain it for you at no cost. So your third option, buyer has received and approved the subdivision information before signing the contract. Buyer does or does not require an updated resale certificate. Now keep in mind, if your buyer checks this, an updated certificate, whether they need it or not, may be completely out of their control because the lender is probably going to need it, especially if you're doing any kind of financing. So if the buyer does require a resale certificate, seller at buyer's expense shall deliver it to the buyer within 10 days of receiving payment of the updated resale. Now, paying the updated resale is usually something that you're going to pay for in advance, and the title company will reach out to you or they'll send you a link to fill out that information. So buyer may terminate this contract and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer if seller fails to deliver the updated resale certificate at the time requested. Okay, so we're going to uncheck that. And then you have number 4. I see number 4 checked often. Buyer does not require delivery of the subdivision information. Again, the buyer can get that information on the HOA website. But if you are representing the buyer, I'm not sure that I would check this one. I would highly recommend that the seller obtain it in advance prior to you signing the contract, and it's right here, depending on how difficult it is to get it. Again, all this is negotiation. Check your facts out and then make a decision. Your buyer actually will be making the decision, not you. Okay, the second part of this that we talked about is going to be the certificate itself. So if I can say one more thing, this bold section right here, a title company or its agent is authorized to act on behalf of the parties to obtain subdivision information only upon receipt of the required fee for the subdivision information from the party obligated to pay. So again, they're going to send you a link and you will have to pay that before they can start acting on your behalf and obtaining that information. So material changes, this is a big one too. So if the seller becomes aware of any material changes in the subdivision information, seller shall promptly give that information to the buyer. The buyer may terminate the contract prior to closing by giving written notice to the seller if any of the subdivision information provided was not true, or if any material adverse change to the subdivision information occurs prior to closing, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. An example of this could be maybe the subdivision has a pool and now they're going to cement the pool in and there will no longer be a pool. Or there's playground, now there's no longer being a playground. Or the subdivision says they're going to take care of your trash or your maintenance of the lawn, and all of a sudden now they're not going to be doing that. These are things that could be an additional expense to your client, so you do want to make sure that they are kept abreast of all of these things, and it is the seller's required to tell the buyer or the buyer's agent this information prior to closing. Now, the second part of this is fees and deposit. So a buyer shall pay any and all association fees, deposits, reserves, and other changes associated with the transfer of the property not to exceed X amount. Now, this dollar amount here, you typically can find it on the MLS for the listing. It's going to say HOA transfer fee and it will have a dollar amount. Usually it's around $300, $350, it could be $450. It depends on the neighborhood, right? And here it says the seller shall pay any excess. So the buyer will pay up to this amount, and anything over that, the seller will pay. And this amount, like I said, could be anything. Check it out. Sometimes the title company knows a lot of the subdivisions and they have an idea of what that would cost also. So then you have your authorization. So the seller authorizes the association to release this information in the resale, and then it's going to be who's going to pay for it. The buyer or the seller shall pay the title company the cost of obtaining information prior to the title company ordering the information. So again, they're going to have to pay that certificate amount in advance, whatever the amount is, and then you pick the buyer or the seller. And you're going to put the buyer's name and you're going to put the seller's name. Remember, again, if it's an LLC, it has to actually be signed by a person. And that's it. We are looking at TXR 1922, Trek number 3610, and this particular form is dated 11/7/2022. All set. Bye for now. See you at the next contract.